The Third Reich built one armoured division it called the best of them all. Not the most famous, not the one with the scariest nickname, the best equipped, the one with the finest crews, the newest tanks, and a piece of gear no other German panzer division could claim. Every single one of its infantrymen rode into battle inside armour. Nobody walked. It cost a fortune to assemble. It was handed to one of Rommel's own former staff officers, and in the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, it was taken apart. Not in a tank duel, not in some grinding week-long siege. On one single morning, the sky opened over a tiny patch of French farmland, and this division simply stopped existing. This is the story of Panzer Lehr, the most expensive division Hitler ever fielded, and how Allied air power erased it from the map. If you have spent time on the Eastern Front, you know the shape of this story. A proud German formation, built at enormous cost, certain of its own quality. Then the reckoning. We have seen it happen in the snow outside a dozen Soviet cities. This time the reckoning came from above, and it came over open ground in the west, but the bones of the tale are the same. Let me show you how it went down. It started at the very end of 1943. On the 30th of December, the German army began pulling together a new kind of armoured division. The name itself tells you what made it special. Lehr is the German word for teach, for instruct. This division was built out of the demonstration and training units of the Panzerwaffe. These were the men who taught other men how to fight in tanks. To understand how strange that was, you have to understand what a demonstration unit actually did. When Germany wanted to test a new tank tactic, when it wanted to show a class of young officers exactly how a Panther screened a flank or how a half-track platoon dismounted under fire, it did not use raw conscripts. It used these men. They were the live examples, the standard, the ones the textbooks were written around. They came mainly from the Panzer troop schools, Panzertruppenschule I and Panzertruppenschule II, the two main academies where Germany trained its armoured crews. Think about what that means for a second. Most divisions are filled out with whatever recruits the army can scrape together. This one was stocked with instructors, decorated veterans, men who had already fought in Russia and North Africa and had survived long enough to be pulled out of the line and told to teach the next generation. A gunner in this division was not learning his trade on the job. He had already knocked out tanks in the snow east of Moscow or in the dust outside Tobruk, and then spent a year explaining to younger men exactly how he did it. Now they were being scraped back together and put into the line as a single fist. The German army was taking its teachers and turning them into a weapon. On the 4th of April 1944, it got its official paperwork name. On the rolls, it became the 130th Panzer Division, but nobody ever called it that. To the German army, to the Allies, and to history, it was always just Panzer Lehr. Command of it went to a man named Fritz Bayerlein, and Bayerlein was not some desk officer handed a plum job. He had been chief of staff to the Afrika Korps. He had served at Rommel's side in the desert, through the long advances and the long retreats, through the good days at Gazala and the ruin at El Alamein. He had stood inside a headquarters when the fuel ran out and the British armour kept coming, and there was nothing left to do but fall back. He knew armoured warfare from the inside. He knew what it felt like to win with tanks, and he knew the exact feeling of losing with them, watching a fine formation come apart, because the other side controlled something you could not match. He had even seen in the desert what enemy aircraft could do to a column of armour caught in the open. If you were going to build the finest panzer division in the German army, he was exactly the kind of man you put in charge of it. So how good was it, really? Let us look at what Bayerlein actually had under his hand in the first days of June. 14,699 men. More than 200 tanks and assault guns, 237 of them to be exact. The mix was a who's who of late-war German armour. 99 Panzer IVs, the reliable workhorse that had carried the army since the start of the war, and had been up-gunned and up-armoured to stay in the fight. 89 Panthers, that long-barreled killer with sloped armour that could punch through almost anything the Allies fielded, and shrug off a lot of what came back. 31 of the Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, low and lethal, built to lie in wait. 10 Stugee assault guns, and 8 Tigers, the heaviest punch in the deck. On paper, this was a collection of armor most German commanders in 1944 could only dream about. But the tanks were not what made Panzer Lehr unique. Plenty of German divisions had Panthers and Tigers by 1944. Here is the part that set it apart. It had roughly 650 operational armoured half-tracks, the armoured personnel carrier, that open-topped armoured box on tracks, enough of them to carry its mechanised infantry into battle riding behind armour plate, every man of them. That sounds like a small detail. It was not. It was the holy grail of German armoured doctrine, the whole idea of the Panzer Division, the idea that had carried German tanks across Poland and France and deep into Russia was that tanks and infantry moved together at the same speed. The infantry had to be right there, riding alongside the tanks, so they could jump off and clear the anti-tank guns, hold the ground the tanks took, and protect the armour when it got into close country where a single man with a satchel charge could kill it. But the German army never had enough half-tracks. It was always short. In almost every other panzer division, most of the infantry walked, or rode in soft-skinned trucks, ordinary wheeled lorries that could be shredded by a single machine gun, or one near miss from a shell. Those men could not keep up with the tanks across broken ground, and they could not survive up at the front where the fighting actually was. Panzer Lehr was the one exception, the only Wehrmacht panzer division fully mounted in both tanks and armoured half-tracks. When its tanks rolled forward, its infantry rolled forward with them, behind steel, ready to fight the instant they stopped. On paper, it was the most powerful armoured division the Third Reich ever sent into the field. The army's showpiece, its prized possession, the single most expensive, most complete fighting machine Germany had assembled in the entire war. And that is exactly why what happened next matters so much. Because the same thing that made Panzer Lehr special, all those vehicles, all that armour packed onto the roads, would become the exact thing that made it a target. A division this size, this heavy, this full of engines and fuel and tracked vehicles, was an enormous thing to move and an enormous thing to hide. The pride of the German army was about to learn that in Normandy in the summer of 1944, the sky did not belong to Germany. It belonged to the Allies, and a magnificent target is still a target. The first lesson came before the division even reached the front. On the night of the 9th of June, 3 days after the landings, Panzer Lehr was ordered up toward a place called Tilly-sur-Seulles. To get there, it had to make a road march of roughly 90 miles from the town of Chartres. 90 miles of French country roads, narrow lanes lined with trees and hedges, with thousands of vehicles strung out nose to tail in a column that stretched for miles. Bayerlein wanted to move at night and rest in cover by day, exactly the careful way an experienced man would do it. He was overruled. He was told to push forward in daylight. Above those roads, the Allied fighter bombers were waiting. They came down on the column again and again. Rocket-firing Typhoons and dive-bombing Thunderbolts hunting a road packed with German armour, working it over from first light. A half-track burning in a lane blocked everything behind it, and a blocked column is a column that cannot run. The men called the route the Jabo-Rennstrecke, the fighter-bomber racecourse. By the time the division reached the front, it had already lost 130 trucks, 5 tanks and 84 self-propelled guns, burning and broken along a road in France, before a single shot was fired at the enemy. Read that again. The best-equipped division in the German army lost dozens of armoured vehicles on the drive to the battlefield. 84 self-propelled guns, gone without ever seeing the men they were built to kill. That was the warning, written in fire along 90 miles of road. Bayerlein understood it better than anyone. He had watched this exact thing happen in the desert years before. Air power was going to be the thing that broke his command, and he knew it long before the end came. He arrived at the front, already blooded, already a step weaker than the army that had counted his vehicles on paper. Then came the British. The first weeks in Normandy threw Panzer Lehr straight into the meat grinder around Tilly-sur-Seulles and the city of Caen. This was the British and Canadian end of the front, and the fighting there was a slow, brutal, close-range war among the hedgerows. This was the bocage, Ancient farmland where every small field was walled in by a thick bank of earth and roots topped with a hedge, the whole country chopped into tiny green boxes. You could not see 50 yards. A tank that nosed through a gap in a hedge could find an anti-tank gun waiting 20 yards away. It was the worst possible ground for armour and the best possible ground for ambush, and the British kept coming into it. On the 13th of June, the British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, who had fought Bayerlein's old Africa Corps across North Africa, drove hard for a town called Villers-Bocage. They were trying to swing around the flank and get into Panzer Lehr's rear to unhinge the whole German line in that sector. For 2 days it was chaos, tanks duelling at point-blank range in narrow streets and sunken lanes, where a single well-placed German tank could wreck a whole column trapped on a road with nowhere to turn. In the end, the British pulled back, and the battle settled without a clear winner. But the message was clear enough. The enemy was probing, pushing, hunting for Bayerlein's soft spots, throwing armoured thrusts at his flanks and never letting up. There would be no rest, no time to refit, no quiet stretch to rebuild what the road march had cost. And the cost of holding the line was enormous. Day after day in the hedgerows, the division traded its irreplaceable men and machines to hold ground. By the end of June, before Panzer Lehr had even met the main American force, the division had taken 2,972 casualties, nearly 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Remember who those men were. These were not easily replaced conscripts. These were the instructors, the veterans, the cream of the Panzerwaffe, and they were dying in ones and twos behind hedges for fields a few hundred yards wide. It had lost 51 tanks and assault guns, 82 half-tracks, and almost 300 other vehicles. The British grind around Tilly and Caen had chewed through the elite division like sandpaper, slowly, steadily, a little more every day. You can see it in the readiness numbers. On the 1st of July, the division that had rolled into Normandy with around 230 running tanks and assault guns could put only about 36 Panzer IVs, 32 Panthers, and 28 tank destroyers into running order on any given day. Add those up. Fewer than 100 armoured fighting vehicles fit to move and shoot, out of the proud fleet that had crossed into Normandy a month before. The showpiece was already worn down to a nub. Still dangerous, still holding. A wounded animal is still dangerous, but it was a shadow of the force the German army had been so proud of. And it was holding in exactly the wrong place. If you are getting value out of this breakdown, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the rise and ruin of these formations every week, and there is a lot more coming. While Panzer Lehr was bleeding out against the British, the American First Army on the western end of the front was finishing a plan, a big one. The Americans had spent weeks crawling through the bocage at a terrible price, hedgerow by hedgerow, paying in lives for every one of those little green boxes. They were sick of it. Every field cost men and bought almost nothing. They wanted to stop fighting the hedges and punch a single clean hole, break out into open country. On the far side, where their tanks and trucks and overwhelming supply could finally run, where American mobility would mean something, instead of being strangled in the brush. The plan was called Operation Cobra, and the spot the Americans chose to punch through, the exact stretch of front they aimed the entire breakout at, was the ground held by Panzer Lehr. The line they picked ran along the road from Saint-Lô to Perriers. The idea was simple and merciless. Before a single American soldier stepped off, they would saturate that narrow strip of front with bombs. Not artillery, not the usual barrage, strategic bombers. The heavy four-engine machines, normally sent hundreds of miles into Germany to flatten factories and rail yards, would instead be turned on a box of French farmland barely a few miles across, with Bayerlein's men sitting inside it. The Americans were going to take the tool built to destroy entire industries and drop it on a single division. They wanted to stop bombing cities for one morning and simply delete a piece of the front line. The morning of the 25th of July, the sky filled up. It began at around 9:30 in the morning, 9:38 to be exact. First came the fighter bombers, roughly 600 of them, working over the forward German positions, the strong points and gun pits right along the road. 600 aircraft hammering a thin strip of ground. That alone would have been a heavy attack. On any other day, the kind of thing a division would remember for the rest of the war. Here it was only the opening act, the warm-up. Then came the heavies. Around 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, the flying fortresses and liberators, droning in wave after wave out of the north, the same bombers that pounded German cities now flying low and straight over a few square miles of Norman farmland. They dropped almost 3,300 tons of bombs. 3,300 tons, onto a target you could walk across in an hour. Behind them came roughly 1,000 more medium bombers and fighter bombers, adding their own loads on top of everything already falling. By the time it was over, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 Allied aircraft had passed over a patch of ground only about 5 square miles in size. Think about that ratio. 5 square miles. Tens of thousands of bombs, including around 60,000 incendiaries, poured into a space smaller than many towns. 60,000 firebombs alone, on top of all the high explosive. The hedgerow country where Panzer Lehr was dug in did not just get bombed, it got saturated. Every field, every lane, every tree line, every dug-in tank and gun pit and command post hammered over and over until the landscape itself came apart. The waves kept coming long after any sane defender would have expected them to stop. There was no shelter deep enough, no position far enough back. The bombing did not target the front edge. It walked across the whole depth of the division. And Panzer Lehr was directly under it. The division took the full weight of the strike. This was not a glancing blow on its edge, not a near miss on a flank. It was the bullseye. The breakout had been aimed at its center, and the bombs landed where the planners wanted them. Roughly 1,000 of Bayerlein's frontline men were killed or knocked senseless in the bombing alone. 1,000 men in a matter of an hour or two from a division already cut down to a fraction of its strength. Whole positions vanished. Tanks that had survived a month of British attacks, the ones that had crawled through Villers-Bocage and held the line at Tilly, were flipped over, buried under tons of churned earth, or torn open by blast that came from straight above where no armour is thick. Bayerlein later put numbers to the ruin, and he had the experience to know what he was looking at. Around half of his casualties, he said, came from the bombing itself. Another 30% from the artillery that came down behind the bombs, the last 20% from everything else. Every signal line was cut, telephone wire torn up, radio antennas smashed, runners unable to cross ground that no longer had paths across it. He could not talk to his units, he could not give orders. A division command, in the middle of the worst moment of its life, went deaf and blind all at once. Whatever Bayerlein wanted to do, he had no way to make the surviving pieces of his division do it. They were on their own, scattered, leaderless, each little knot of dazed men fighting or dying without any larger hand to guide them. His description of what he saw is the part that has stuck for 80 years. Bayerlein said his front line looked like the face of the moon. A moonscape, he called it. Bomb craters touching rim to rim as far as he could see in every direction, overlapping the ground beaten and rebeaten into something that no longer looked like earth at all. No fields, no hedges, no roads, just a grey-churned waste of holes, smoke and wrecked machines. He said something like 70% of his troops were out of action. 70%. Dead, wounded, driven out of their minds by the endless concussion, or simply too dazed to lift a weapon. And he reported up the chain what the men around him could already see. His division, the finest the German army had built, the showpiece, the prized possession, was finally annihilated. The numbers after the smoke cleared tell the rest. In that sector, Panzer Lehr could field only about 7 tanks in working order. 7. From a division that had once counted its armour in the hundreds. From 237 tanks and assault guns on the 1st of June, down to 7 still able to move and fight in the days after Cobra. What was left of it, somewhere around 2,200 men and a scattering of vehicles, was no longer a fighting division in any real sense. Command and control was broken. The headquarters records were gone, buried or burned. The men who survived were survivors, not a force. You cannot give orders to a unit that no longer has wires, no longer has officers, no longer knows where its own pieces are. The American infantry and armor that rolled forward after the bombing did not break through a strong defense. They walked into the wreckage of one. There were pockets that still fought, scattered guns and stubborn crews who made the Americans pay in places, because even a shattered elite division has hard men in it. But the line as a line was gone. The hole in the German front was real, and it was wide, and within days the Americans were pouring through it into open country, swinging out and around, beginning the breakout that would carry them across France and trap a German army at Falaise within weeks. Operation Cobra worked, and it worked by erasing the best division the enemy had on that stretch of front. There is one more piece to this morning, and it has to be told straight, because it shows just how blunt and terrible a tool the carpet bombing was. The bombs did not all fall where they were meant to. From 4 miles up, with smoke and dust drifting back over the lines, and the front marked only by coloured panels and a thin road, the margin for error was tiny, and the consequences were not. Some of the heavy bombers, coming in on the wrong heading or dropping a beat late, released short, behind their own lines, onto American troops massed in the open and waiting to advance. The friendly fire toll was savage. More than 100 American soldiers were killed by their own air force that day. 111 men. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who had come forward to watch the attack from close up. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in Europe in the entire war, and he was killed by American bombs. That is the brutal arithmetic of what happened over Saint-Lô. A weapon big enough to wipe out the proudest division in the German army was also a weapon that could not tell friend from foe with any precision. It killed an American general on the same morning it annihilated Panzer Lehr. Air power on that scale was a sledgehammer, and a sledgehammer does not aim, it simply falls. The Americans accepted that cost, terrible as it was, because the alternative was more weeks in the hedgerows, and Cobra broke the deadlock in a single morning. The weight that crushed Bayerlein's division was the same weight that, by a few seconds and a few hundred yards, killed their own. So step back and look at the whole arc of it. Panzer Lehr was the most expensive, best-equipped armoured division Germany ever built, stocked with instructors and veterans, the men who wrote the book. The only one of its kind to carry every infantryman into battle behind armour. Handed to one of Rommel's own, a man who knew armoured war as well as anyone alive. On paper, the most powerful panzer division in the world. And it never lost a great tank battle. That is the strange, important truth at the centre of this. There was no single duel where a better enemy tank rolled up and shot it to pieces in open country. Its Panthers were never outclassed gun to gun. Instead, it was nibbled to death on the road by fighter bombers before it ever arrived. Ground down for weeks by the British in the hedgerows, a few men and a few tanks at a time, and then finished in a couple of hours by waves of heavy bombers it could not touch, could not answer, and could only crouch under and endure. The finest tank crews in the German army spent the worst morning of their lives unable to fire a shot at the thing that was killing them. The lesson the German army learned over Saint-Lô is the same one it kept learning, from the steppes of Russia to the fields of